I am currently working as a coach, a 3 principles-based coach.
Yeah.
I work with individuals who, recently, a lot of my one-to-one coaching has been with people who really want to take what I've called a deep dive into the principles. I also do some group programs, and I've written 3 books about the principles, and I have a 4th one coming out shortly. I've recently teamed up with another coach to offer some other programming related to the principles. So we're creating downloadable audios and some fun group programs for 2017. So yeah, that's kind of how I would describe myself right now, at least professionally. Yeah, so I was first told that I had post-traumatic stress disorder back in, it must have been 1990 or 91, somewhere in there. I had no idea that I was exhibiting those behaviors because at that time I had just literally escaped a marriage with my life at that point. I married somebody when I was quite young. I was 22, and he became abusive immediately after we got married. I didn't see any hint of that beforehand, but everything sort of exploded right after we got married. And at the time, I was so young, I really didn't know what to do. I was really confused by his behavior. And I immediately had the thought of, well, I guess I must have done something, to make this happen. And so I essentially spent the next 7 years in that marriage trying to change the situation, trying to change his behavior, trying to change my behavior so that he wouldn't act that way. And it got to the point where it was pretty severe abuse in pretty much every aspect that you can imagine, from sexual assault to, almost killing me, to, everything, threatening people that I cared about. And about 5 years into the marriage, I had my daughter. And so when she was about 2, some other things happened that were so scary that I realized, if I didn't get out with her, she may not have a mother anymore. So I managed to get out of that situation. But because of some other circumstances, I was essentially forced to deal with him for several more years after that because of some arrangements with seeing his daughter. And eventually, when she was 11, I'm kind of shortening this whole thing, but I had found out when she was a toddler that he was also abusing her. And I tried to get the authorities involved, and nobody could help me. They said she was too young to be believed, et cetera, et cetera. And then when she was 11, she revealed that this abuse had continued all that time. So we went through another protracted court battle to try to get his parental rights revoked. And eventually the judge agreed that she didn't have to see him anymore. So essentially I had to deal with him in some way from age 22 until I was about 40, 41 years old. And it was a very difficult 20 years, to say the least. And all during that time, even very early on in the marriage, I started seeing a psychotherapist because I didn't know what was going on. I just knew something was wrong. And no one that I saw, interestingly enough, during the marriage, I saw probably 4 or 5 different mental health professionals during the marriage. No one even asked me if there was any abuse going on in the marriage, which looking back is sort of hard to believe, but nobody asked me. And because of the way my brain was a little bit flipped around, I didn't know that that was what was going on either.
Mm.
The first time I realized that I was in a domestic violence situation was, I'll never forget this. So in Los Angeles, when you file for divorce and you have a child, you have to go through mandatory counseling through the court. And I was sitting in the waiting room waiting for the court-appointed psychotherapist to come and meet with me. And there was a big poster on the wall about domestic violence. And it said, if you check off any of these things, you may be in a violent relationship. Well, I checked all the boxes. And I had this thought of like, oh, that's what's going on here. Now I see. It was kind of like the light bulb went on. So my life basically from 22 onward to about age 50-ish, 52-ish, was a series of psychotherapists, psychiatrists, psychologists trying to figure out how to help me have a better life. Plus me going through different programs and, you know, trying all kinds of different tools and techniques. And one day I stopped to count how many professionals I saw, and I stopped at 25. Wow. Because I just said, okay, 25 is like the minimum or the maximum I'm going to count. I don't want to count anymore. And all told, I really didn't feel any better at all. So the last therapist I saw was around 2011, 2012. And she was probably, of all the people I saw, she was the best one. And I came out of that process. I saw her for about a year and a half, feeling better than I had in a long time. And that lasted for about a year or so. And then I started to kind of spiral back downward, and all of my post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms started to come back. And I got really, really angry because I thought to myself, you know, first of all, I didn't ask for this to happen to me. You know, I didn't ask for somebody to do this to me. So that felt like, you know, really, that just really made me angry. And then second of all, I was thinking to myself, you know, I've done all of this work to try to help myself. It's not like I've been sitting around doing nothing, you know? And I still feel terrible. I still feel unhappy most of the time. You know, I had moments where I felt okay, and I had things in my life that I cared about, but I wasn't having a very good quality of life overall. It was pretty dismal, I would say. And I was kind of at the end of my patience. You know, I didn't really know what to do at that point. I had a lot of anxiety all the time. I lived in fear most of the time. I was afraid for my physical safety. And to be fair, at times that was a legitimate concern because my ex-husband was not a very stable person. And for a while I was living near him. So, you know, there was some fear like that. But even after that, you know, was changed after I moved away from where he was living, I had a lot of stress, just daily stress, anxiety, fear. I had a lot of nightmares. I had a lot of flashbacks. I had trouble sometimes being close to certain people, just physically close. I didn't like being, like when I moved here to New York from California 9 years ago, almost 10 years ago, I had real trouble at first being on the subway. Like if there were like men that I didn't know, obviously, who were near me, I didn't really like that. So I'd sort of get panicky. And my life was pretty much ruled by those sorts of feelings. I also, and this is something that not a lot of people talk about, but I think it's a really important one, at least it was for me, was I also was really consumed by jealousy. I had tremendous envy of people who hadn't been through something like I had, who had what I perceived to be the freedom to be who they wanted to be and do what they wanted to do, and to not have what I saw as a burden that I was carrying. And that was a major part of my life, was that kind of feeling too.
Mm.
Well, up until I got married, my life was very normal. I had had nothing like that. My parents were fine, great people, never any abuse or yelling or anything like that. I'd never encountered any violence in my life before him. So I had no, I think that was part of the problem in a way, was I didn't know what to do with that. It was completely unfamiliar to me. And the psychotherapist who made that diagnosis was somebody who specialized in working with both victims of domestic violence as well as perpetrators. And I remember it so clearly because she kind of said it in a very offhanded way, that this is what I had. And I was kind of like, and I remember thinking, well, that's a mental illness, I guess, right? And it just sort of took me aback, and I also remember that experience very clearly because she told me, this is hard to believe, but she said, after I'd seen her a few times, she said, I feel like I'm not going to be able to help you. And I said, why is that? And she says, because I've never dealt with anything quite like I've seen with you in terms of the type of abuse that you've been through and the way that your ex-husband is behaving. And this is somebody who'd been doing this kind of work for a long time. By then she was probably in her 50s and had been doing this for her whole career. So I remember thinking, wow, like, how sick am I then? I mean, I really thought at that point, like, wow, I must be really bad off because this person who's really experienced doesn't think she can help me.
Okay.
So that was kind of another shock to my system because my ex-husband was not, I went to some group sessions with other women, and my husband's behavior was very different from what they described of their spouses. None of them had molested their children like mine had. And none of them, every single one of them talked about sort of a honeymoon period after some abuse, then the spouse or partner would, be really nice to them. That was not the case with me at all. I never saw that ever. So I didn't feel like I really fit in with that group, for better or worse. So that was a really interesting time for me, kind of wrapping my head around what was really happening. So nothing was really made evident until after I left the marriage. And it wouldn't have come up at all had my daughter not disclosed what was going on with her. When that came to light, that sort of put a new spin on things, and I, was asked to go see other specialists and was interviewed extensively. And the part about that first court process that I'll always remember is that after the psychiatric examination, they said that I was the one with the problem, that he had a slight anger issue and might want to consider anger management classes, but I was the one who was psychiatrically damaged, or however you want, psychologically damaged. And I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting, So I didn't get much help from the system, and I tried I used every resource I had to try to get more help legally, and I was just not able to get any. So I pretty much had to resign myself to her seeing him, continuing to see him without my supervision, which was really, really challenging. I did that for 9 years, basically. So that was not a fun time either. I haven't been in a battle zone, but I liken my experience to that because that's pretty much how it felt to me while I was in that marriage, and, pretty much having to be just very, very careful about what I said and did, and And also, of course, being concerned about my daughter's safety, and then trying to make sure that nothing was happening to her. So yeah, I think, looking at it from that perspective, it does look a little more complex than probably the typical. I was so concerned about my daughter's safety that actually the opposite was on my mind. My only goal, and I'm not just being figurative, my only goal in life was to live until she turned 18. That was the only thing I ever thought about. I didn't think about what I wanted to do for work. I didn't think about anything. I thought about, I want to live long enough for her to turn 18 so that she never has to see him again if she doesn't want to. And even after we finally got a court ruling when she was 12 saying she didn't have to see him anymore, I still had that as my sole goal in life, was to live that long. And so no, I was kind of the opposite of that. She turned 18 10 years ago.
10 years ago.
Yeah, she's 28 now. I got remarried when she was 9. And when she turned 18, her stepdad adopted her. So now he's her dad in every respect. So that's really nice. Nothing really changed in my life experience. No. It was really, I remember having some real difficulties. Even, let's see, we're at the end of 2016 right now. Even as late as like 2011, when I started to see this other psychotherapist, I was feeling pretty bad. So that's a long time. I got married to my first husband in 1983. So if you look at that on a decades scale, it's a lot of years to be feeling bad and not really understanding what to do to help yourself. I've thought about this a lot, and it seems like, looking back, that there was something in me that was still telling me that there was an answer out there, and I just hadn't found it yet. I thought I had exhausted all the options, and yet there was something driving me to keep looking. And I don't really know how to explain that, but that's just how it was for me. And one day I was online and I was looking for a software product, and by random chance, I came across a company's website that linked to the owner's personal blog. For whatever reason, I clicked on this blog and I landed on a page where she had herself on video, and she was talking about a book. Now, I mean, really, this was about as random a thing as you could get. And she's talking about this book, and she's holding it up and saying, this book, changed my entire life. And she was, very enthusiastic about it. And not in this wasn't like a sales pitch video. This was a very personal video that she had on this blog. It had nothing to do with her business or anything. And she was so passionate and so excited about what she was saying that for some reason, I just was captivated and I kept watching. It was like a 45-minute video where she was literally just talking about what she had learned from reading this book. And the book was called The Inside Out Revolution by Michael Neal. And by the end of the video, I thought to myself, well, I have no idea what she was saying. It kind of sounded like gibberish to me. It didn't really make sense. But I just was listening to her. I thought, all right, well, I'm going to buy this book. I've read everything else. So, maybe there's something in here that will be helpful to me. And I also was intrigued by the subtitle of the book, which seemed completely insane to me. It was The Only Thing You Need to Know to Change Your Life Forever. And I thought, wow, he's really arrogant all right, so I bought the Kindle version, and I like listening to audiobooks. At that time, I was commuting to and from work every day, so I downloaded the audio version, and I started listening to it. And same with the experience I had watching the video, I didn't really understand what he was saying. But there was something in there that I wanted to investigate further. So I think I listened to that book probably 5 times in a row. I would get to the end and start it over again. And I would do this on my to and from work commute and during my lunch hour. Every day I was listening to this. And somewhere, I think during that 4th, 5th, 6th listen, somewhere in there, a huge light bulb went on in my head. Like, I remember it so clearly because I was on my lunch break and I was walking on Broadway, sort of near Lincoln Center. And there's like a little place in the middle of Broadway where you can sit down. And I had to go sit down because I felt like I was going to fall over. That's how big this insight was for me. And what I heard him say that suddenly clicked was that there wasn't anything wrong with me. And there had never been anything wrong with me. And not only had there never been anything wrong with me, but there could never be anything wrong with me. That anything my ex-husband had done to me or to my child had no effect on who I actually was. And that the only thing that had been happening all these years was I'd been having some kind of transient thinking and I'd been listening to it. But that thinking didn't mean anything. It was just repetitive, habitual thought that I had decided to listen to. And it was the absolute biggest moment of my life. No, there's nothing even has come close. Even having my daughter, even, losing my parents, those are big events. This was bigger than that. Wow. I can't even describe the impact that it had on me. So nothing's been the same since then. Suddenly saw myself as, this is kind of hard to explain, but I started to see myself as part of, not so personally, I guess I would say. I saw myself as simply a human being who was having thinking like every other human being. And that was all that was happening. So it wasn't like I was somehow, sick or separate from other people. It was like, oh, okay, I get it. So everybody has thinking that they listen to. Mine happens to sound like this, and I could see what it was. But, I'm looking around Manhattan. I'm like, well, that person has other thinking that they're listening to. And suddenly everybody kind of looked the same, including me. I didn't feel like I was separate in any way from anybody else. And I also was very, very aware of the fact that that who I actually was something far, far, not to sound egotistical or something, but bigger than what thinking I had all day long. And that was really a huge insight, because I had always identified with my experience, my thinking, what had happened to me. And suddenly all of the stuff that had happened to me started to look very different too. It was like, oh, so, yeah, there were incidents that occurred that maybe I had some thinking about, but that doesn't mean that anything actually happened to me. Big M, me. Mm. Wow. Because that's untouchable. There's nothing that can touch that. There's not even a question about that anymore. And so within about So I should say that I kind of tested this out over a period of several weeks, going, is it really thought that is causing me to feel this? Or, is it something external or is it internal? And I tested it over and over and over again to see, okay, like today I'm on the subway and I feel anxious, but yesterday I was on the subway and I didn't feel anxious. So why would that be? And I just conducted all these little experiments over a period of weeks. And within about 6 weeks, because I was kind of keeping track, I started noticing that I really wasn't feeling anxious at all anymore. And kind of that daily experience that I had had for so long was not there. And I started to feel a lot more at ease and a lot more peaceful. And that was very, very new to me.
Wow.
Yeah. It was a pretty rapid change in my experience of life, I have to say. They just went away. And it's really weird because I was as skeptical as anybody. By that point, you can probably imagine, after having done all these other things to try to help myself, I really didn't have any belief or anything that anything was going to change. And the weird thing was that I didn't actually do anything to affect this change in myself. It happened on its own simply by my seeing what was really happening in my own head and realizing that, okay, so I can have a thought about whatever, anxious thing, and I can have any kind of feeling like that, but that's not actually hurting me. And I'm really not obligated to listen to it if I don't feel like it, in essence. And this part, I always have to tread lightly here because I think it can be misconstrued. But I saw that I was causing my own suffering unwittingly. I didn't know I was doing that.
Wow.
But, my ex-husband was nowhere to be seen. I hadn't had contact with him by that point for, 13 years or something. So, it just suddenly became very obvious to me that I was innocently causing myself suffering, and I could just not do that anymore if I didn't want to. That's what helped me. I know, after that happened for me, I started telling everybody I knew about it. I gave everybody copies of that book, and then I read other books, and I went online and I listened to more people. So, other people might encounter this in a different way and have a slightly different, it might have a slightly different impact, or it might take longer, shorter, whatever. But I have never seen anything that explains the human experience so clearly as these 3 principles do. And it really was, it was so easy really to get what it was saying, that I really feel like it's the gift of them is their simplicity. And there isn't anyone I've ever spoken to about this who hasn't understood what I'm saying. It's a lifelong process of continuing to look at it because it's infinite, like anything big in life. There's never an end to what you can see, but the essence of it is very simple to understand. The 3 principles, as they're called, were originally expressed by a man named Sydney Banks, who is now deceased. And essentially what they describe is how human beings are having this experience of being human. And 2 of the principles kind of work in tandem, so I sort of think of them as one, which are thought and consciousness. So thought, as he described it, is the way humans experience everything. If we don't have thought, then nothing exists to us. And the implications of that are quite big, because what he was really saying was that the world isn't happening to us. Life isn't happening to us, but life is being projected from our thinking. So what we see is not a world out there, but it's what we're seeing in here, what we're listening to in thoughts. And the reason why consciousness is sort of the tandem to that is that because we are awake and aware, that brings thought to life. So that's what gives us this amazing experience of being human. Kind of reflecting what I was saying about my trauma-based thinking, because I was listening to a constant stream of thoughts related to that, that's how the world looked to me. Mm-hmm. As soon as I realized that those thoughts were kind of random, and I had just been listening to them for a long time and realized, hey, I don't actually have to listen to them, they started to fade into the background, and then my experience started to change. So that's kind of a nutshell description of thought and consciousness. And the third principle has been the one that I've personally been exploring more in the last 12 months or so, which is the principle of mind, capital M. And the simplest way I can say that is that it's the intelligence behind life. It's what is making things stay alive and continue to come into the world. And as I see it, it's really the essence of who we are as humans. It's a formlessness that is really who we are, that we're not this constant stream of thoughts going through our head that consciousness brings to life, but we're something else entirely. And I want to also point out that it's different from any other self-help or psychological thing I can think of, because it is not telling you what to do. It's simply describing how you're experiencing life. But that's enough, because the fact is that if you are aware of this, that is all that needs to happen for it to start having an impact on your life. And the piece about my being whole and unbroken, because I used to see myself as such a broken person, and recognizing that I actually wasn't broken at all. I've seen that if I simply let my thoughts be and I don't try to do anything about them, there's kind of a natural sense of peace that starts to permeate my experience. And that's true for everyone, that's our baseline feeling, is one of peace and composure. And if we simply let feelings and thoughts kind of just roll through us without giving them so much concern and worry, we can have a lot more of this natural sense of peace every day. I would say that I know it can really look like events cause us to feel a certain way. But the longer I have been involved in looking at what these principles are showing, the more it's become obvious to me that that's not true. And I can even look back during that marriage, for instance, and I can see a few things. One was that there were plenty of times when my ex-husband wasn't around, and I was feeling awful. There were other times when he wasn't around and I was feeling great. So how would I explain that? I can only explain that because it was whatever state of mind I happened to be in right then. It had nothing to do with circumstances. And the more I have actually looked at my past history, the more it's kind of morphed into something else, where now it really looks more like two people who were confused. I was confused about where my experience of life was coming from, and I thought he was responsible for the way I felt, and he was doing the same. He didn't understand that feelings of, security and confidence and all of that were innate. And so he thought he had to get those feelings by harming another person. So he was listening to thinking just like I was. He was listening to thinking telling him he needed to hurt me in order to feel better. And so I almost, like, again, I'm not going to excuse or say that his behavior was socially or any other way acceptable, but it makes total sense to me now. I had tortured myself for years, asking myself, why did he behave this way? And now it's just so obvious that, like every other human being on the planet, he had thinking that he was responding to exactly the way I did. His thinking was different from mine, but we were both doing the exact same thing. And so is everyone else. So I think that this is an important piece of this, is that my experience now of all of that is very, very different. There's no, I'm not mad at him anymore. I don't have any feelings like, I don't know. I can't even really conjure that up anymore. Where I used to be very angry at him. I was angry for years and years and years, and I just don't have that anymore. It's not part of my life. Well, I certainly understand that, because that's how I was living for all that time. But I saw that that was suffering that I was creating for myself that was unnecessary. And that and this is sort of a bigger piece, but it's applicable, I think. If we're going to move away from these kinds of behaviors, if we're ever going to make progress in domestic violence or in any other area, but talking about that, we have to understand what is actually behind someone's behavior. And there's only ever one reason, and that's because they are confused about where their experience is coming from. They think that there is something out there that they have to control or do something about. And they're not seeing that every single thing that they are experiencing, every feeling, everything is coming from momentary thought. And so, yes, people do bad things, do things that could, they kill people, they harm people physically. And I don't want to gloss over that, because I understand it very, very well. However, if we want to effect change, this is as far as I can see. Now I'm 55 now, so I've been around this a long time. This whole, domestic violence and all of that discussion. If we're ever going to see change, this is, to me, the only way we're ever going to fix this problem. Is to help people see what is really going on, how they are really experiencing life. And I see no reason at all for anyone who has been through it, like on my side, as the person on the receiving end, needs to suffer one day with that. That doesn't help anyone. Certainly doesn't help the person themselves. And it doesn't help to do anything about this problem that we've got in society.
Wow.
There is some work being done in domestic violence, at least in the UK. I don't know about the US, but I have spoken to people who are teaching this to perpetrators and survivors as well. And it is having a tremendous positive impact. It's stopping violence in some prisons. It's helping people to understand that just because they have a thought doesn't mean they need to do something about it. Because they don't. They can wait for a new one to come in. They don't have to respond to whatever that one is telling them. And that goes for people on my side of the equation. where I saw that I could have a thought and I didn't have to do anything about it. It wasn't telling me anything important. It wasn't saying that I was sick. I didn't have to worry about it. And that was a huge, huge turning point for me. So I would imagine that if my ex-husband could be shown this, he would benefit as well. I can't imagine a single person who wouldn't. There is something about just the primal instinct to protect yourself that sort of kicks in. So I can't really say during the marriage if it would have. It certainly would have helped me if I had known, if someone had told me about it sooner. If even one of the professionals that I saw had sat across from me and looked me in the eye with all sincerity and said, you're okay, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with you, and had seen me as the healthy and whole person that I actually was, and had explained to me, the reason why you're having this experience is you've got some thinking that you're listening to and you don't have to. That would have changed everything for me. But nobody did that. Everyone saw me as someone with a problem and somebody with, a mental illness that needed to be dealt with. You don't have to suffer anymore. Suffering is optional. And some people have said to me, well, it sounds like you're taking the whole burden of responsibility onto yourself. And I say, yeah, I am, because it is me. The experience I have is coming from within me. So taking responsibility for that is a great thing, because that's helped me see that it's nothing or anyone out there that's doing anything to me or has even done anything to me. It's simply thought that I can listen to or not. And if I don't, I kind of get naturally returned to this set point of peace. And that's the best thing I can say to anybody, really, is, whether it's Michael Neal's book or another one, I can't speak highly enough of having an understanding of these 3 simple principles. And it's not just me. It's helped a lot of people through all kinds of things: addiction, depression, manic depression, schizophrenia. It helps people with all different kinds of problems, and not just people with problems, but people who want to have a better experience of life, no matter what their situation has been. Right now, I have 2 main things that I'm doing, where I write and self-publish short books based on the principles, and I'm going to continue doing that. I kind of to come at the principles from different angles so that people can access them very easily. So that's an important thing for me that I'm doing. And I've also been working with another coach to help people to kind of look towards possibility, to not get so caught up in all of this thinking, but realize that there's an entire infinite well of possibility right in front of us if we just kind of look over here instead of over here. And so I'm very much about helping people to see what's really possible in their lives.